Yeah, thank you, Edric and Shane, for the invite for us to come and chat with you all today. It's quite surreal being stuck in a lockdown in England and seeing these beautiful pictures of you all in lovely parts of the world. But I think we can find some more wherever we go, even in awful times. Okay, great. So how this is going to work is I'm going to give you a talk for 20 minutes or so on the feeling and the state of awe, and then I will pass over to Ollie, who will go into a series of meditations. We have a walking meditation and then an object-based meditation, which will give you a flavor of how we are seeing and practicing awe ourselves. So yeah, let's jump in. I first want to just tell you about a story that I had and how my introduction to awe came about. So last year, around May time, I was invited to an event with monastics from Thich Nhat Hanh's Plum Village. They came to London, and it was a miserable grey night in London, nothing like the scenes I'm seeing before me that I'm very jealous of right now. It was cold, rainy. So we went to this event, and it was pretty routine to begin with. If anyone's been to any sort of Buddhist event, there was standard meditations, people sitting in silence, and then it changed because they handed out these tangerines, these small little orange fruit. And as they gave us these fruit, they asked us to do a mindful eating exercise. So it's pretty simple. It just notice the fruit. How does it feel in your hands? What are the imperfections? How does it smell? And then you peel back the skin and notice how the skin tears, and how does it feel as you're tearing the skin? How does the smell change? And it's a really intense and fully involved experience. And that was wonderful. But then they stepped it up and they said, where did it come from? And this question unraveled a whole series of mental leaps for me. And it's probably the reason why I'm sat here talking to you today. It was a really profound question because, first of all, I just assumed that someone took this from the supermarket and that was enough. But then it was like, where did it actually come from? You know, we don't grow tangerines in London, so they must have come from somewhere abroad. So the tangerine came from overseas, and it must have grown on a tree, and it must have come from the soil, and the tree it probably was around for a few years before it bore its first fruit. And then it grew from a flower, and the flower had to be pollinated. So there was a bee, and there was a beehive involved, and there was a whole ecosystem around the bee. And the sun had to give energy and photosynthesize the plant. And then someone had to pick the plant, and then there was a story around the person, and they probably had a family. And that particular fruit had to travel via boat or by plane to get there, and then everything that went into into that vehicle to get it to the UK. And it just became like, okay, wow. It dawned on me that what I was holding at this point wasn't just a tangerine. It was sort of the universe. It was everything in my hands. And that sounds kind of trite to explain it as we sit here now, but I can tell you that experience wasn't so profound. Wasn't so trite when I was having it. There was another sort of realization with this as well. That was the taste in my mouth of this tangerine, this moment that I was having, was only made possible by all these series of events that happened before. To give you a bit more of a specific example of that, the water that was in the tangerine, where did that water come from? Just moments before it became a tangerine. How it passed through the soil? It must have been in a cloud. It must have been in a river somewhere. And so it became clearer to me, at least, that these small moments that we take for granted are not just a moment in themselves. They have much more history than we give them credit for. And so we'll keep this example in mind as we go through some of the experiences or some of the requirements for awe as we go through it. So what is awe? Well, here is a very academic answer to awe, and I'll break this down, but it's always an emotional response to perceptually vast stimuli that overwhelm current structures, yet facilitate attempts at accommodation. Now, yeah, this is very academic, and it basically translates as whoa. This is the layman terms, and we've even got a wonderful emoji for it these days, which is the mind blown emoji. This, if you have to have or as an emoji, this is of course what it's going to look like. So what do we mean by whoa? Well, it's when you're stunned. It's when you're stopped in your tracks. You're completely enraptured by something that has stolen our attention. Everything else seems to fall by the wayside, and it's worth noting that always an emotion, but it's also a state of mind. And I'll go into that a little bit. So I hope you can see now that that experience that I had with this tangerine was really a whoa moment for me. It was something quite profound. So I'd just like to take a second now and just have a think based on what I've said so far. Like, when have you felt awe? Has there been a time in your life, perhaps looking at starry skies or standing on a mountainside, seeing an athlete perform the impossible, perhaps a piece of art that you've looked at and gazed upon? What has been the stimulus for provoking awe in yourself? And I'll keep this time in mind. They're probably something that came to mind quite quickly. Keep this in mind as we go through the following examples, and see if how your experience relates to the sort of more academic, the science of awe. Okay, so with a truly awesome experience, there are two requirements. The first is perceived vastness. This means that whatever the stimulus is, you have to be seen to be small in relation to that object. So it's worth noting as well, it can also be an object, but it can also be a concept or realization. So typical objects that invoke perceived vastness are nature-based objects. So things like mountains or vistas or trees, things that are physically bigger, much bigger than ourselves. And it's obvious to see there where the perceived vastness requirement comes from. But when you're dealing with something that's an idea, a concept, that becomes a bit difficult to see where perceived vastness comes from. So the tangerine meditation example that I gave, obviously I'm bigger than the tangerine, but I'm not like that much bigger than the tangerine. I'm not going to get perceived vastness from our physical relationship. But what triggered the perceived vastness in this instance was the interconnection of things. It was that systems thinking lens which allowed me to see this vast supply chain almost, and how I related to that. And I became very small in this much big greater experience. The second requirement is a need for accommodation. So this says that whatever this new information is that I take, how do I fit that into my existing worldview? And to give you a concrete example of this, well, this is based on Piaget's ideas of adaptation. And so Piaget's ideas of adaptation involve assimilation and accommodation. Assimilation refers to the process of incorporating new information into your existing worldview and your existing knowledge structures. And accommodation is about adapting our existing knowledge structures to fit in this new information. So the reason why there's a Pomeranian on your screen right now is if a child meets a small dog, so this is going to be the example, if a child meets a small dog, they're small, they're fluffy, they're cute, they're not going to get into trouble with a small dog. They're pretty safe. And a child meets a small poodle afterwards, but they look visually different. A child uses the existing knowledge to know that the poodle is a dog too. It's small, it's fluffy, etc. But then if a child meets a large, fierce dog, it needs to accommodate this new stimulus to sort of update its dog schema so that it knows that this is also a dog, even if it doesn't look like the dog that it has known previously. It needs to adapt its existing structures. And so this is the need for accommodation. And this is what awe requires. So in my example with the tangerine, the need for accommodation came from this realization that, you know, really everything is connected in some way. And it's something I hadn't thought about before, particularly in the specific example of this taste sensation requiring a series of events that I had no idea about before. And this required this supplied the need for accommodation. So why should we care about awe? Well, it's a difficult one. We will walk around and we will grow as humans, and we will just stumble upon awe-based experiences all the time. But awe has been shown to be very, very good for our minds. There's a lot of psychological benefits for awe-based experiences, and this is why I think we should be trying to cultivate awe in the same way we cultivate things like flow and mindfulness. And I'll get onto that in a second. So some of the benefits you can see here. There is this idea of the small self that people and researchers and all talk about. And this is where awe diminishes a person's sense of self. They shift their focus away from their own concerns. You go from an egocentric viewpoint to an allocentric one. So egocentric is focused on the self, where allocentric is focused on others, and awe will trigger that. Similarly, we talk about humility when we talk about awe, and people feel a lot more humble. There's a study that was conducted which people high in dispositional awe, so that's people that will regularly just achieve states of awe, were considered more humble by their friends. And this was an interesting observation. People that experience awe are higher in open-mindedness. They experience a lower need for cognitive closure. And so they're open to modifying their worldview. There can be differences in perception of time as well. Time can appear to be, more abundant. And I believe that this may be a reason why during lockdown and when there isn't much novelty in our lives, that time seems to accelerate and become very, very fast, because we lack any awe-based experiences. We get positive mood boosts from this. There's been studies that show our elevated moods. We feel more connected, and this is interesting from my example because there was a very, very obvious feeling of connection, but general based experiences help people more connected to other people and to humanity and to the planet as a whole. Other benefits include decreased materialism, so people will all start to appreciate their sense of selfhood as less separate, and they have they concern less about mundane concerns, and they're bounded by their daily experiences instead of their desire for money. It also can trigger scientific thinking and learning, as well as spiritual consideration, which is an interesting sort of dichotomy. We often place science and spirituality at odds, but awe-based experience can actually invoke both. This is an interesting diagram, and so some of the benefits that I just mentioned, you may have noticed in other practices that you've done, things like mindfulness, meditation, or psychedelia, and particularly things like mood improvement and connectedness are things that we associate with those practices. And this is because awe, like those experiences, is also a self-transcendent experience. And possibly if you're already pursuing some of those beneficial states of mind, you might now consider to add awe to your repertoire, as I say. So this diagram shows the experience of self and of the world as coming closer together. So you can see from the left, we have something like a flow-based experience, which there is a little bit of connection, but it's not completely integrated. And then something on the far right, which is peak and mystical experiences, where the two completely overlap and you become well, I guess this is where we get into the realms of sort of ego death and just complete giving over to the environment as a whole, and or sits somewhere in between. So there are different flavors of awe, and these are different triggers generally, but I'll quickly run through this list. So we have ability-based awe. This is admiration of a person's exceptional ability or skill. It can be admiration for someone's musical ability or athletic ability. And we've got an image of a rock climber there. That often invokes awe for me personally. There's beauty-based awe too, triggered by aesthetic pleasure. So this could be beauty of someone, someone that's soundly beautiful, like a movie star. Or it could also be something that we see in nature. So if you're looking at a beautiful desert island, that could invoke awe, or a beautiful tree or flower. You can get awe from that. Virtue-based awe is felt when witnessing another display virtue and strength of character. So I've got a picture of a monk here. So someone sitting quietly in retreat for years and years and years might invoke a state of awe. But also seeing someone run into a burning building, for example, like first line defense workers. These people are all doing virtue-based activities and can trigger a sense of awe in us. There's threat-based awe as well, which is on the flip side. It's generally something that's negative. It's accompanied by fear. Charismatic leaders can invoke a state of threat in us. But additionally, just dangerous things. Like if you're confronted with a lion or a tiger, something that is able to just, extinguish your life, that can probably invoke a type of threat-based awe. Also, things like tornadoes and natural disasters, storms can invoke this type of awe as well. And I think that's probably something that you'll get readily when you see sort of lightning strikes and things like this. And then we have supernatural based awe too. This can be glorious or terrifying, about unexplainable activities, things which we don't really know the answers to. If we attribute to something that's supernatural, that can often invoke a feeling of awe. So wonder and horror are two sides of the awe coin, if you will. Wonder draws us into something and horror pushes us away from that. So I've got two images on the screen now. Hopefully you can see them both relatively clearly. On the left, we have a white blood cell chasing and ultimately consuming a bacteria. Now, I think you can frame both of these images in a wondrous and horrific way, but this, when I saw this, just like made my jaw drop. I didn't actually think that white blood cells were chasing foreign cells around our body in this way before. So this really was a really amazing thing to see. And so this was wondrous in the sense that it drew me in and I was very sort of interested in it, but it can also have a horrific edge to it. If you're looking at this and you're seeing this type of interaction going on in your body, that feels to me that could invoke some form of horror. It does look something that's out of a horror film, as this blob chases around a small speck. And on the right, we have Earthrise, which is a picture that was taken by some of the first astronauts as the Earth. I think it was a spaceship that was going around the moon. They weren't actually landed on the moon, but it was going around the moon. And they took this picture when the Earth came out the other side. And it's a really fantastic picture. But this demonstrates the overview effect, which astronauts often claim, which says that as you see everything you've ever known on this tiny blue dot floating in space, you get this real profound sense of awe. And this is incredible. It's wonderful to see, but it can, I think, really clearly shows a level of horror. It's like, this is this tiny blue dot, and everything you've ever known is on this blue dot, surrounded by this darkness, and it really is a rock floating in space. You know, can we just, everything you've ever known being obliterated in a heartbeat? And so this is really a question about framing as well. How do you frame something so that it becomes wondrous, or something that becomes horror? And eventually, if you keep I think the name is transframing, when you adopt bigger and bigger frames of reference, eventually you come to a point where the frame, you won't be able to hold it anymore. And once that happens, it becomes sort of existential. And there's a lot of horror, at least I've experienced a lot of horror in sort of the existential. So that's something to consider as well. So a quick one on cultivating awe, and how we can go about finding more awe in our day-to-day. The first one is an awe walk. So there was a study that came out, I think it was back in September, that got picked up in various media outlets of, they invited, I think it was older people, I forget what age they were, 60, 70, 80 years old, to go out on walks each day, and just not to focus on things too much, but just to keep an open awareness to what you see and what you notice, and almost invoke this sort of childlike sense of wonder as you go on these walks. And they found that people's life satisfaction increased. So that's one practice you can do. Interestingly, they asked people to take a selfie as well. And normally when people take a selfie, they are the biggest thing in the frame. But what they found is, after taking these awe walks, this sense of perceived vastness was shown in the selfies, when the item of scenery was much, much greater than the self. So that was an interesting side effect of those awe walks. The next one is getting out of our social media bubble. I think that when you're on social media, you're going to be shown things that you already know. And something that's important for cultivating awe is new information. You have to be receptive to new ideas and new concepts that come your way. So novelty is important. You're not going to get awe by getting the same information over and over again. And that's because of the need for accommodation of requirement. So removing yourself from your social media bubble and pursuing new information, I think, will invoke a sense of awe more readily. Museums are a great place for that. You can go and consider, I don't know, I guess many things in different museums. And so visiting museums and spending time there can certainly induce a state of awe. Spending time with children, they have this innate sense of awe built into them. They're walking around the world, seeing things newly for the first time. You'll notice things that you've forgotten that were significant for you at one point. I think that's a great way of cultivating awe. Pursuing different opinions in culture and art forms. If we're pursuing the same thing all the time, we're not going to get a sense of awe, because this need for accommodation requires new input. So by looking for differing opinions, differing art forms, we will be shown things that we haven't considered before. And that's going to be an important part of it. I think travel is very good for that. So spending time in new places, you immediately see how things are done differently. That's going to induce a state of awe. You're going to be in novel environments, novel surroundings. All of that is going to create a sense of awe and wonder in us. And then finally, reframing. So this is actually an idea that our app is built around. It's how do we take an object that we're familiar with, but categorize it and look at it from a different angle and different perspective. And I think koans can do this. If you're familiar with Buddhist koans, how do we look at something in a different way? That can just be proposing a question, or it can be meditating on an object from a different perspective, literally. So the reframing aspect a useful way of cultivating more as well. But this is quite a tricky one to do, because how can you reframe something if you haven't if you're used to it in a certain, think about it in a certain way. Yeah, and so novelty is an important aspect for this, as I mentioned. I don't think we have time for this one, but it was an example of looking at a mug in a different way. Okay, wonderful. So yeah, I'm just going to drop it in now. We have a brand new app that launched yesterday around the feeling of awe. It allows us to deeply connect with nature. And Ollie's going to give us an example of some of the meditations that we have in the app and some of the reframings we have with nature. So yeah, I guess that's my part coming to an end.